Well, hello, fellow classmates. I got to tell you that this was a fun assignment this week to talk and read a little bit about leadership styles. Um, as I mentioned in my previous videos, with 30 years of military experience, I've had a chance to experience probably the full range of leadership styles. I've been led for many years in many situations, and I've also been a leader in many situations. I have come across good leadership styles and some not so good. And from personal experience, sometimes I've had successes as a leader, and I have had many failures also as a leader. So this week's readings really reinforced some of the things that I've kind of already knew, but also gave me a different perspective on some other styles. What I learned in 30 years of military experience is that there really is no right or wrong answer when it comes to leadership. A lot of times it's trial and error. From this week's reading, the two leadership styles that really or theories that stood out to me was situational approach theory and the path goal theory. So let's just jump into the discussion a little bit. So the first one I want to talk a little about is the situational approach theory. It was pretty much discussed or put into practice in 1969 by two gentlemen, one called Paul Hersey and other one Ken Blanchard. And the theory really centers around the development continuum of the way subordinates develop over time. One of the key things that a leader has to kind of take into account when talking about this specific theory is assessing where the subordinate is in his development and position, and then making some adaptations to the way the leader is going to interact with the subordinate. Bottom line is the leaders have to match their leadership style, to the competence and the commitment of the subordinates in order to kind of meet the organization's objectives. So how does this happen? Well, the employee goes through four different development levels. The first one, D1, as is explained in the book, is the employee has low competence but a high commitment. D2, the employee has some level of competence but not really committed to the position. D3, the employee has a high to moderate competence level but low commitment. And then D4, both are highs. Level of competence is high and the level of commitment is high. Based on those specific levels, those four levels, the leader then should adjust his leadership style to better motivate and meet the objectives goals. So for example, for D1, where you have low competence but high commitment, the leader should be directive in his mannerisms. And then for D2, where there's some level of competence but low commitment, then the leader should be a little bit more of a coach in the way he adapts his leadership style. And then you go all the way down, and obviously once you get to D4, where you have both high competence, high commitment, then at that point the leadership should be more of a delegating style and not necessarily a directive or a coaching, but essentially allowing the worker to do what he or she is supposed to do. So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this type of leadership style? Well, the strength, one of the things is very recognized as a standard. Most folks practice this kind of leadership style intuitively. Second thing is easily understood. I mean, most folks don't require a lot of theory and background to understand that based on the situation, you could adjust the way you deal with subordinates. Three is fairly clear to follow. I mean, it doesn't take long to explain to someone how to assess your subordinates' capabilities and then apply a leadership style. So it's easy to kind of lay out as a framework. And then probably fourth and most importantly is it stresses that there's not one specific style when it comes to leadership. Some of the weaknesses for this specific leadership theory is there's not a lot of research on it. So there's been not a lot of work done to kind of assess the wellness of this theory. And the second thing is it doesn't really explain how the leader motivates the development of the employee. So how do you take an employee who's at D1 and eventually get to D4, which is where you want to be? So essentially, those are the strengths and weaknesses of this specific theory, the situational leadership theory. The next leadership theory that I selected was the path goal theory. Path Pro theory was pretty much brought into practice in 1971 by Robert House. And this theory centers on how leaders motivate subordinates to accomplish a designated goal. So essentially focus on the goal of the subordinate in order to achieve the organizational desires. And it emphasizes on what the leadership needs to do to make that happen. This theory emphasizes the relationship between the leadership style to use, the characteristics of the subordinates, and the actual work setting of the organization. So those are three key components, which is extremely important, because it takes into account the leader's personal style, what the subordinates' characteristics are, and then essentially what is the situation at hand, the work setting. And the bottom line for this theory is to enhance the employee performance and satisfaction by focusing on motivation. Okay, so how is this specific theory applied? Well, it's kind of a path. So if you figure that the subordinates are on a certain path or trajectory, he or she is going to come across some sort of obstacles. The obstacle could be personal growth obstacles. It could be knowledge-based obstacles. It could be family obstacles. It could be the environmental obstacles. It doesn't matter what the obstacle is, but what the leader does is that the leader helps the subordinate define what the goals are to reach a certain level of productivity, works with them to identify the path and how to remove those specific obstacles. So that's really where the key is. So you identify the goal, you identify the obstacles, you develop a plan of action that'll help you remove those obstacles, and then you coach him along through support in order for him or her to reach his or her final goals, and in the end, increase productivity. So, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this specific theory? First of all, a strength is the framework can be used for different leadership styles. So it's not focused on one type of leadership style. It can focus on many different leadership styles. And more importantly, it integrates motivational theories in its application. So by focusing on the goals of the subordinate and what it is that motivates him or her, it integrates those motivational factors in order to kind of get the best out of your employees. So those are the two strengths. Some of the weaknesses of this specific leadership theory is that it depends on a lot of different assumptions, as far as what are the things that are important to the subordinate, the environment, and that if you do certain things, it's going to get you to a certain end. Another weakness is very similar to the situational approach to leadership, is that there's a lot of research is lacking in this specific theory. And also another weakness is it doesn't show how exactly the leader would motivate the subordinates. So I don't necessarily see that as a weakness, because I think that's also very situationally dependent. And then another weakness that the book stresses is that it's very leader oriented. It fails to recognize the interaction between the leader and the follower, which I also disagree with the book, because at the core fundamental of this leadership theory is the fact that the leader and the subordinate work together to define goals, define a path, identify how to get over obstacles, and then eventually provide support. So I don't necessarily agree with the two final weaknesses that the author talks about in the book. I do agree that it does rely on a lot of assumptions, but the last two I don't necessarily agree with. Okay, so lastly, why are these theories interested? Why am I interested in these theories? Well, once again, what I've learned through years of experience in the military is that leadership is not about the led, leadership is not about the leader. It's really about the led and about the organization. The leader just happens to be a steward of those resources that has been granted to him or her for a period of time. Leadership is very situational. We have to be flexible in our leadership style, as long as we don't violate our core beliefs. I mean, as long as we follow those basic things of integrity, moral ethics, and don't violate whatever your core believes, you should be able to adapt your leadership style to the situation, regardless of what it happens to be. And then lastly, God created us all as individuals. We're very different, so one style does not fit all. If you think about the disciples were all different, from fishermen to tax collectors, and they all had different styles and different ways of spreading the gospel. And even Jesus applies situational leadership. If you look at John 2, the way he handled himself in the temple, that style was very different than the way he handled himself when he met the woman in the well in John 4. Both the same individual, both showing leadership traits, but at the end of the day, Jesus applied different leadership styles for the situation, and he did apply both path goal theory for the situation, specifically in the woman in the well. So if our Lord Jesus Christ could apply situational leadership and path goal theory, then I think it's pretty good for all of us to think about. So once again, it was a great assignment this week. I really enjoyed it. And hopefully you guys learned a little bit about these two theories and why I thought they were important. God bless.